I'm Derek Bruff, and I'm excited to spend a little time with you today talking about teaching and learning and technology. By way of introduction, I'll share that I am a teaching center guy. I was at the Vanderbilt University Center for Teaching for 17 years, more than a decade of those as the director of the center. And I am now a visiting associate director at the Teaching Center at the University of Mississippi. As a teaching center guy, my role on campus was to work with faculty and other instructors and help them think through the teaching choices they were making, course design, assignment design, lesson planning, that kind of thing, and to be more intentional and effective as teachers, to explore foundational teaching principles and practices, but also to figure out kind of new things to do in their teaching. And it's fun work. I get to work with faculty in lots of different disciplines on different parts of campus and see what teaching and learning looks like in their context, and kind of see how the choices we make as teachers can really affect students for the better. And so I have a particular interest in teaching with technology. And so sometimes technology can be used to kind of make what we do more efficient, which is great, but also it can open up kind of whole new avenues of teaching and learning, which is really exciting. And as I was talking with faculty and others about the ways that they use teaching, I started to see patterns, some kind of common threads in not so much how they use technology, but why they were using technology. What were they trying to accomplish? What were their goals? What kind of learning experiences were they trying to create? And so a few years ago, I put all that together in a book called Intentional Tech: Principles to Guide the Use of Educational Technology in College Teaching, and try to extract from all of these stories some principles, right? Some reasons for using technology. There are 7 principles in the book, because if you write a book like this, you have to have 7 principles, right? I'm not going to talk about all 7 today, but I'm going to pull out a few that I think are pretty useful for the current audience. And my hope is, as I share some of these ideas and examples, that you will get some inspiration for your own teaching, new technologies you might use, or different ways of using technology, activities or assignments that you might work into your teaching, but also some language and some concepts that you can use to kind of talk about what you're doing as a teacher, or just be more intentional, as the title says, in how you go about your teaching. So we'll get started, though. Before we jump into our first principle, I have a question for you to consider. What are 5 to 6 technologies you have used or seen used in teaching contexts? So think for a minute about the kinds of technologies either that you're familiar with and you use all the time, or maybe some more unusual ones that you've seen in action once or twice. What does your landscape of technology look like as you think about teaching in your context? And ordinarily, if we were in a live workshop session, either in person or online, I would ask this as a polling question. So I would have all my audience members get out a phone or other digital device and respond with the technologies they have in mind. And usually I do a word cloud at this point, so you can kind of see what the more common responses are and what the less common responses are. Today, however, I want to make sure that the people who are watching this live and the ones who are watching it later will have kind of equal opportunity to participate. So I'm going to set this question up as an assignment in Echo Poll, and you'll get a link to that assignment. It'll have some other questions there as well. But this is a question that you can respond in writing to asynchronously, and then kind of compare your answers to your peers and colleagues there. But as you have this technology landscape in mind, I wanted to share my favorite educational technology, which is wheels on chairs, actually. So I'm a mathematician by training, and I teach sometimes in math departments. And when I walk into my classroom, I have a plan for the day. I have a set of learning activities I want my students to engage with to help them master the concepts and techniques of the course. And those activities vary from day to day. Sometimes we're doing small group work, and sometimes we're doing solo work, and sometimes I've got some whole class activities. And it's really helpful when the furniture in the room can be responsive to my pedagogical goals for the day. And when the chairs and the tables have wheels, the furniture is just easier to move around and make it work for what I need to do in class that day. And so that's why wheels on chairs are my favorite educational technology. I will say a good polling tool is a very close second. I do a lot with polling in the teaching that I do, whether multiple choice or free response polls. But the reason I share this for a couple of reasons. One is that when we think about educational technology, we tend to think about digital and online technologies. But there's a lot of analog educational technologies that we know well and we use often. And whether that's wheels on chairs or chalkboards or whiteboards, these are technologies that we tend to kind of know what they're good for and what they're not good for, and we're used to seeing them and using them. And so we don't think too much about them as a special challenge, but we all use educational technology in our teaching on a regular basis. Even the HVAC and the lighting in the classroom are kind of part of the technological infrastructure that we rely on. One thing is that analog technology is still educational technology, but the digital and online technologies are often ones that are changing, they're newer, we're not quite sure yet what they can do. And so it makes sense for us collectively to explore those and kind of see what we can do with them. So we will focus a lot more on digital today, but I wanted to remind you that analog counts too. The other reason I shared this story is that there is an underlying principle here that our pedagogical goals need to drive our technology use. And so it's really clear in the wheels on chairs example in the classroom, I've got a plan and I want the technology, the furniture to support that plan. In all other contexts, we need to be thinking about our pedagogical goals first and then trying to find the technologies that might help us achieve those ends. So I want to kind of keep those priorities in mind as we go forward. So let's talk about our first teaching principle here for why we might use technology. And it's one I call times for telling. So the image here that you'll see is you may recognize this from YouTube. This is the classic Mentos breath mints in Diet Coke demonstration. The idea is that you take Mentos breath mints, which kind of come in a tube, and you slide them into a 2 liter of Diet Coke. And there is quite the reaction. You get a geyser of Diet Coke not too long after. I've done this a few times. Mine has never reached quite the heights that you see here in the image, but I think there's some engineering at play here. But it's a really fun thing to do with kids. And we've done it a couple of times. I've done it a couple of times with younger children. And it's really interesting to see them react to it. First, they think it's kind of cool that, the Coke explodes and there's this geyser of Diet Coke, but they also want to know why. Why does it work? Why does this happen, right? And I can imagine in, a college context, maybe an introductory chemistry or physics class where you might be talking about the science behind this. You could lecture for 15 or 20 minutes on the science here, right? The gas that's trapped in the liquid and the ways that the surface features of the Mentos breath mints kind of activate that gas together. You could do that lecture, and then you could blow up the Coke, right? And the students who hadn't fallen asleep during the lecture might be kind of amazed at the Coke geyser. And the students who did fall asleep might wake up at that point. But you could also start with this demonstration, blow up the Coke, ask your students to conjecture why this is happening, and then provide your explanation at that point. And I would argue that second strategy is probably going to be more effective, because by starting with the demonstration and asking the students to conjecture a little bit, you are interesting them in this topic, you are activating their prior knowledge, you're getting them ready to kind of understand the explanation when you provide it. And that is what educational researchers Schwartz and Bransford call creating a time for telling, right? And this is one of the ways that we can use technology, is to kind of set our students up with experiences that get them ready for learning. And so the way that I've summarized this, giving students a hard problem or a novel experience can help them get ready for learning, and technology can help with that. So a couple of examples. As I said, I'm a big fan of polling. It is my second favorite educational technology. And here is a multiple choice polling question that I've asked frequently in my probability and stats course. Your cousin calls to say she's having twins. Which of the following is more likely? Assume that she's not having identical twins. Is it more likely that she has twin boys, twin girls, one boy and one girl, or are all three of those choices equally likely? Now, I'll ask this question of students at the beginning of my unit in probability in my course. I've also asked this question of a lot of faculty and a lot of teaching workshops over the years. And typically when I ask this question of either students or faculty, I get a distribution of answers that looks a little bit like this. There's usually a couple of votes for twin boys and twin girls, but most of the votes are around the third and fourth options, one boy and one girl, or all three are equally likely. And so what I'll do is I'll poll my students or my faculty audience. They'll respond using whatever polling technology that I'm using. I get this bar graph that kind of shows me the distribution of responses. If it's like this, I'll show my students that bar graph, right? Because it's pretty clear from here that we don't have a consensus, that it's probably the third or the fourth choice, but the students don't have a clear consensus. And so then I'll have them turn to their neighbor and I'll say, talk it out, put your heads together, try to answer this question correctly. If you both already agree, you could both be wrong, so talk it out anyway, right? See what you can come up with. And so then the whole class starts buzzing with noise as students are talking about this particular probability question and trying to kind of reason it out and argue with their peers about what the right answer is. Then I will poll them again using whatever polling technology I'm using. And then we'll often see a little bit of a shift at this point. Students will change their minds as a result of this kind of peer interaction that they're having. Often it's a shift in the right direction, not always. Sometimes they go in the wrong direction. But in this case, at least with this data, they're moving towards the right answer, which is one boy and one girl. I don't tell them that at this point. What I do after they've had a chance to talk it out and we see the second set of results is then I'll ask for some volunteers to share why they picked their answer or maybe why they changed their mind, right? I'm trying to surface the rationales and the reasoning that my students are bringing to this. And so we'll hear from some folks who are arguing for one boy and one girl. We'll hear from some folks who are arguing that all three are equally likely. Usually that one person who's stuck with twin boys as their answer wants to speak up and share their perspective, and that's okay. We want to hear that too. And then in this case, I can actually do a simulation. So I'll ask my students I used to ask them to get out a coin to flip, but no one has pocket change anymore. So I tell them to get out an ID card and assign one side to boy and one side to girl, and to flip the card twice and to get some data, right? And we'll actually use the polling system to collect that data. I do tell them that this is a math class, right? This is not social science class. We are going to make some simplifying assumptions. We're going to assume that there are two sexes here, a boy and girl, and we're going to assume that they occur 50-50, equally likely. Real life is more complicated on both of those dimensions, but for our mathematical model, those are the assumptions that we'll make. And so flipping an ID card twice makes sense as a way to simulate this experiment. We get a lot of data really quickly from the students, and then it's very clear that you get a roughly 25-25-50 breakdown between twin boys, twin girls, and one boy and one girl. And so at that point, they're ready to hear my explanation. And I won't do the math for you right now, but I have this little tree diagram where I kind of show them how we model it and why we end up with a different set of results here, that not all are equally likely. The short version is that you can have boy, 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 girl, girl, boy, or girl, girl. And so two of those equally likely outcomes are grouped together as one boy and one girl. So you end up with more of those than the other two. And the reason, I mean, this takes like 20 minutes in class at least to go through the 2 rounds of voting, the peer interaction in the middle, and the simulation and my explanation. But I know that my students come in with a misconception about probability, that all things are equally likely when we do these probability examples. And it's not that simple, right? We have to very carefully model the things that we're trying to model, right? And come up with the right answers. And so I know if they have that misconception and they carry it through, they're going to be in trouble for the entire unit on probability. So I'm happy to spend 20 minutes of class time at the beginning of that unit, creating this experience for them to really confront that this conception they have is not right? We need to think about this in a more nuanced way. And that's the time for telling, right? My explanation came at the end of this process. And the process, I think, is pretty important. It's often called peer instruction. This was a term coined by Harvard physics professor Eric Mazur back in the late 90s. I'll pose the question, the students answer independently. I'll look at the results. And what I showed you was the third branch. Ideally, the students are split. You've asked kind of a Goldilocks question that's not too hard and not too easy. Students are split, you have them talk it out, and you kind of continue with maybe a second round of votes and then some class-wide discussion. Sometimes in a math class, right, where we have right and wrong answers, sometimes almost everyone gets it right? And then we can kind of move on fairly quickly. Sometimes most of the students get it wrong, and then it doesn't make sense to have them talk to each other at that point. I need to backtrack, maybe ask a simpler question or provide some more context for them. But ideally, I'm in that Goldilocks zone, right, where the question is kind of hard enough to spend some good class time on, and we do the peer instruction, we do the second vote, we do the class-wide discussion, and end up with an explanation that hopefully makes sense to them, that this process gets them ready to understand that explanation when it comes finally. They have conjectured, they have activated prior knowledge, they've talked it out with their neighbor, they're ready to make sense of my explanation when I give it. And they're also a little bit curious about it. They want to know why it's not the thing that they expected it to be, right? So there's a kind of motivational structure here at play. And I will say that the technology, I think, is actually pretty important, because with the polling technology, I am asking and expecting every student to commit to an answer. So I'm asking every single one of my students to think about this in conjecture. So I think that's important. And then also the bar graph itself can help convey that there's something interesting happening here. And so I like to be able to show that bar graph in a way that like a show of hands might not have the same impact. Now, my first book came out in 2009. It was all about doing this kind of thing. Back in the day, we only had these little handheld clickers that could only do A, B, C, D questions. And so this book is all about multiple choice questions and how you might use them. There's a lot you can do with multiple choice questions. We have more options now with more recent technology, but there's lots of things you can do with a multiple choice question. So a couple of more examples briefly. This was from a colleague at Vanderbilt in ophthalmology. Basically, here's some information about a patient. Given this information, the scan that we have, how would you treat? And Janice tells me that there's a couple of good answers on this list, and there's a couple of definitely wrong answers, but there's not a single correct answer. And so the idea is that you would poll your students, or your residents in this case, about what they would do. And there's not a single right answer, which is a little disruptive. But the goal is not to get the right answer. The goal is to argue from evidence and reason towards a better treatment, right? And so the same peer instruction structure works, because the goal is to get them talking about why they would treat it in this way or in that way, and what do they know about these treatments, right? So it's the structure that gets them to the kind of learning that you want them to have. Or different discipline. Rob McDougall teaches history and military history. When and where would you rather have lived, right? Different times, different places. Again, not a right answer here to this. But in the context of a history class, this could generate a lot of really good discussion. And so maybe not so much a time for telling, but a time for discussion, right? And a time for engagement after a question like this. In my own class, I teach sometimes a seminar on cryptography, codes, and ciphers, and we talk about encryption and surveillance and privacy. And so here's a question I'll ask. Colleges and universities should be given wide latitude to use electronic surveillance in the interest of campus security, even if that means students' privacy is not always respected. Agree or disagree, right? And when my students, again, the technology is helpful here, because this bar graph shows that there is a range of opinions in this classroom that the students have. And so that's going to set me up for a class-wide discussion a lot more than if I just ask for a few students to volunteer their responses, right? Then those first couple of responses are going to kind of bias the whole conversation that happens later. Whereas this helps us see, yeah, we're going to have to talk about both sides of this, because both sides are well represented in this class. So polling questions are great for creating times for telling. It's not the only thing you can do, though. For my book, I interviewed Alicia Carabinas, who teaches writing. She's now at Grand Valley State University. And she assigned her students a online game. It's very old school. If you were gaming in the 80s on your computer, you might have seen these kind of text-based games. This one's called 905. And in it, it's all text. It looks like this. You're on a blue screen and you're giving commands, and the game is kind of responding. And you wake up at 9:05 in the morning and you don't remember where you are, and you're in some apartment and you don't know what's happened. You have to start kind of exploring and kind of figuring out what's going on. I won't spoil it for you. There's a really interesting twist in this game, and it only takes like 20 minutes or so to play and kind of get to the resolution. But the thing about this game is that the computer is a little dense. Like if you want to take a shower, right, you can't just type take a shower. The computer says it's generally a good idea to take off one's clothes before showering. So you type take off clothes, and then you take off the clothes, and then you try to get in the shower, and the computer tells you the watch you're wearing isn't waterproof, right? So it's this kind of thing where the computer is really taking what you're saying pretty literally. And so you're going to have to think carefully step by step about what you want to do and communicate that well. Alicia will have our students play this game outside of class and have this experience. And her students typically did not play text-based computer games in the 1980s. And so they find it a little frustrating. And they talk about that in class, about how it was like to communicate with this computer who didn't make any assumptions about what you were saying. It just kind of took you literally. She's teaching a writing course, and she wants her students to think about their audience in a similar way. If you want to connect idea A and idea B and see what that connection is and help your audience understand that, you have to articulate it. Your audience can't read your mind in the same way that this computer can't read your mind in this game. And so by giving the students this kind of strange game experience, she's able to make that point with them about the importance of being specific and explicit in what you're writing about. So I thought that was really clever. Here's another example. This one's pretty analog. These are some shots of us playing a game at Vanderbilt called Replay Health. And it's a healthcare policy simulation. And it's a little complex, but the main idea is that you were throwing beanbags at targets. And the better the target, the more reward you get. And you're in these kind of little towns, right? So like 8 or 10 of you will play together as a town, and you're throwing these beanbags at targets. But everyone has a little wallet that has some information about the character that they're playing. So kind of health related information, right? This person is overweight, this person smokes, this person has health insurance, this person doesn't, right? This person has a high stress job, these things like this. And what happens is you're throwing beanbags to try to earn points or money for your town, but every so often an event card is drawn. And if you have certain health risks, then your health lowers at that point when that event card is drawn. And then you have to stand further back from the beanbags, the beanbag targets, the worse your health is. And so you do this for a few rounds, and then every so often the town can get together and vote on policies that might help, right? So maybe you institute a smoking cessation policy program in your little town. And now all of a sudden, anyone who has smoking as a health risk doesn't get to kind of use that anymore. And so if the smoking event is called, they don't suffer any penalty, right? And so there's lots of different policies, and it's a really fascinating way to help students see how healthcare systems work, not just individuals and their experiences, but systems of healthcare. And so there's more information at the link on the slide. It's a really interesting way to get students to the point where they start to think about systems level stuff, which is really hard. And a good game can help students think about systems level. So what's going on behind a lot of these examples? Well, this is a picture I took several years ago in central London. And as I was crossing the street, I looked down and there were these helpful reminders that said, hey, look right, traffic is coming from that direction. And, you know, I have a mental model of how traffic works based on my experiences in the United States where we drive on the right side of the road. When I get to London, they drive on the other side of the road, and my mental model is not correct for that context. Now, if I'm standing at the sidewalk, I can kind of think through, okay, they drive on the other side. That means I would be this if I was driving, which means as a pedestrian, I need to look to the right. Like I can reframe my mental model with some effort, but it's certainly a lot easier to just look at the sign and then look to the right. But that's what's happening with these times for telling. Our students come into our classes with mental models about how the world works. And some of those models are great, and some of them are lousy. Some of them are wrong. Some of them are incomplete. Some of them lack nuance. But changing our mental models is hard work, right? Just like it's hard for me to kind of rearrange kind of which direction the traffic is coming if I'm in London. But that's what we're called to do, right? Is to help our students develop more sophisticated, nuanced, and useful mental models of the way the world works. And so to get them to the point where they're going to do the work to change their mental models creates like you need to create these types of experiences where they see this is where my mental model doesn't quite match what's happening, right? It's insufficient for the task at hand. That's going to motivate them to try to change that mental model in a useful way. Okay, so that was principle number one, creating times for telling. Great thing you can do with some technology. For principle number two, I've got a little story to share. This is me several years ago at age 40, trying to learn how to ski for the very first time. I do not recommend doing that. If you're going to learn to ski, do it before the age of 10. So that's my very practical advice. It's very hard to learn how to ski. The first day, I basically had no control over my skis, and the only way I could stop myself from speeding down the mountain was to throw myself into the ground. The second day, I had figured out the wedge, the little pizza shape, where you can kind of slow yourself, but only if you've activated a bunch of different muscle groups in the exact right way to slow yourself down, right? So it was exhausting actually to use my legs like that all day long. The third day, I slept until noon. I was tired. And then I learned the French fry, which is a much easier way to control yourself down the mountain. But in all of those experiences, my body needed to develop some physical skills in order to go down the mountain at a speed I was comfortable with, right? Again, not too fast and not too slow. And every time I fell down or struggled or made a wrong turn, right, my body was receiving feedback on what was working and what was not. Now, cognitive skills are not physical skills, but this idea that we need practice and feedback is still critical. Our students need to practice doing the things we want them to learn, and they need to get useful feedback on that practice. That's the key principle here, and technology can play a role in helping our students have opportunities for practice and ways to get feedback. So before I share some examples, I want to come back to something that I kind of referenced earlier, right? If you're gonna, this is a study by a couple of sociologists who observed a whole lot of classrooms, and they found that just 5 to 8 students will account for 75 to 95% of college classroom discussion, regardless of class size. You've probably seen this, right? Where you throw out the question and you hear from a few students, and it's the same students you heard from last time, right? It's those 5 to 8 students who carry the whole load. And I share this because this notion of practice and feedback is not one that most faculty find surprising. Like, they know that our students need practice and feedback. If you talk to math faculty, they'll say math is not a spectator sport. You got to do math to learn math, right? But what happens often in our classrooms, whether that's online or on site, is that not all of our students are getting that practice on a regular basis. It's often a handful of students who are getting that practice, but not all of the students. And so one of the ways that technology can come into play is to try to create these opportunities for all of our students to get the practice and feedback they need. And so I've got another story here and a metaphor that I find helpful. Back when I was in middle school, the thing to do on a Friday night was to go roller skating. And so we would go with my friends and we would roller skate. And I was not particularly good at it, but it was the thing to do. And I remember the DJ would come on and say things like, it's now time for couple skate. And so if you had a date, you could grab their hand and go out and skate romantically, I guess, which was totally achievable by a bunch of 14-year-olds. Or the DJ would say that it's time for the hokey pokey. And you would skate out and put your right foot in and your right foot out and shake it all about. And I have to say, there was a certain skill level required for the hokey pokey on roller skates, so that you didn't fall down. And so I often opted out of that. I generally didn't have a date either, so I missed those too. But after one of these special purpose activities, the DJ would come on the loudspeaker and say, it's all skate. And that was the signal. All you needed was skates on your feet and a willingness to get out on the floor, and you were invited and encouraged to skate. And it's those types of environments that I think we need to be thinking about creating in our classrooms, where it's not just 5 to 8 students who are skating, but it's all students who are skating. Ways to invite and encourage all of our students to participate in the learning process together, to get the practice and feedback that they need. And so let's look at a few ways to use technology for doing this. One of my favorites that I learned about during pandemic teaching was what I call a ready, set, go question. Some people call it a waterfall question, but if you're on Zoom or some other kind of live video conferencing tool, there's often that text chat area right there. And so it's very easy to ask a question, put it in the text chat, say it out loud, and then ask all of your students to compose a response to that question, but not to hit enter until you say go. So you give them a chance to type, and you might hear them typing or see their fingers, right, when they're done typing. And then you say go, and then all these responses pop up at the same time from all of your students. And this is such a simple strategy, but it's such a great way to give all of your students a chance to think about this question, come up with a response before they see their peers, and now you get to see all their different responses. So it's a bit like a polling question. It doesn't have the kind of aggregation effect of the bar graph, right, which makes it really easy to kind of see where everyone is all at once. This takes a little bit of reading to go through, so you might take a minute or two and encourage all of your students to read through their peers' responses. And then maybe you'll find 2 or 3 that you want to call on and hear more from students around their responses. But the nice part is, with a multiple choice polling question, you have given students their answer choices. This is completely open-ended, and students can often surprise you with the perspectives and experiences that they bring. And it was great that teaching on Zoom and other platforms like that for a little while helped us see this is a really simple structure, and it's really easy to implement. And you can do it in an on-site classroom as well. You just need a little technology, some type of back channel technology. Or you can even do this with a free response polling question. The idea is that you don't show the responses until everyone has had a chance to respond. Really great way to create an all-skate moment in your class. I should say, if you've got 100 students, you probably don't want 100 responses all at once, right? So this is better for small classes. But even in large classes, you could have kind of groups of students respond. So group A is going to respond to this question, and next week, group B will respond to the question. So you can kind of rotate around and hear from all students eventually. Now, I mentioned the back channel, and one of the weird things that happened in 2020 was my most popular blog post of 2020 was one I had written a decade earlier about teaching with back channels, because all of a sudden we had that text chat handy in our teaching. There's a lot of different things you can ask students to do on the back channel. Again, whether you're online or on site, you can create these back channel opportunities, ask students to take notes, to share resources, to ask questions, to answer each other's questions. A lot of different things you can do there. I will say that a lot of faculty find it a little distracting to try to read the text chat while they're teaching, right? And that's fair. I'm that way as well. So one thing you can do is to kind of have a back channel break, like a ready, set, go question, where actually you're not talking like everyone's on the back channel at the same time doing something with text. The other option is to have what I call a voice of the chat. So I got this from the late Steve Gilbert years ago, to designate someone in the classroom, right? Maybe a TA if you have one, or even a student, and this role can rotate among your students. Their job is to pay attention to the text chat, and then at maybe designated moments, you will turn to them and say, what's been happening? What are the questions that we need to address together? So that you're not having to kind of mind the front channel and the back channel at the same time, but you can be intentional about inviting participation from lots of students on the back channel, but structure it in a way that you can actually manage it. And I should say, one of the other things I think that a lot of us learned during the pandemic is that the students who didn't speak up in class, in our physical classrooms, might actually speak up on the text chat more often. And so you kind of broaden your notion of class participation, and you can end up hearing from a lot of different students and different perspectives that they share. Another tool that I think is really great for creating these kind of moments of practice and feedback for all students is social annotation. So this is a screenshot of Perusall, but there are other tools like Hypothesis and even Google Docs. You can throw a Google Doc in and have students highlight things and ask questions or comment in the margins and have a whole discussion that happens there. And unlike a traditional discussion class where you can only hear from so many students about so many different things, there's kind of as much space here as you want for students to see what's interesting to them, what do they have questions about, what connections are they making, and then to have kind of digital space for them to kind of share those perspectives and ideas and engage and interact with each other. And I think there's also something really powerful about the kind of anchoring that happens when students, you're not asking them to do the reading and then write a reflection paper or to come to class and talk about it. You're actually asking them to respond in the moment, in the text, and to connect their comment with the thing that they're commenting on. And I find that this feels more authentic for students, and that I think you can often get better results and better engagement than a kind of traditional discussion board. So I think there's a lot of power here. I will say that sometimes it's nice to give students some ideas for what to do with this annotation space. And so one structure I've used, I borrowed from some different sociology faculty that I saw present at a conference on structured reading groups. And so one time I was doing this, I had students annotate a reading together, but I had different groups of students, and each group had a different role to play in the annotation space. So some students were the passage masters. They were trying to find key quotes that we should discuss together, and they would comment on why they thought it was important. The creative connectors would highlight things and then make connections to other things we had studied or things outside of the course. The devil's advocate, their job was to argue with the author, right? And that's what they would do in the annotation space. And then there were the big questioners. They were the ones who were trying to find the big questions that we could explore through bigger assignments later in the semester. And one thing I like about this is that it simplifies the reading and annotation task for any individual student. Instead of having to do all of these different cognitive processes at once, they get to focus on one. And that makes the reading assignment a lot more practical for them to accomplish. It also means that there's reason for them to see each other's and read each other's annotations because they're doing different things, right? If we're all answering the same types of questions, then I might not be interested in my peers' answers because I've already answered that question. But if my peers are doing different things, I've got more motivation to see what they put there and maybe respond. One more example of practice and feedback. It is 2023 as I record this, and so we need to talk about AI, generative AI like ChatGPT. And so I'm going to call this ChatGPT as kind of a near peer. I heard about this activity when I was visiting Yale this spring. There were a couple of faculty members there, Tisa Winger and Erica Helgen, who were teaching a master's level course in the Divinity School. And they wanted to kind of see what they could do with ChatGPT in a useful way in their teaching. And the assignment they hit on was to give their students a set of prompts that their students could give to then ChatGPT, which is one of these generative text generators kind of powered by a large language model. And it's really good at kind of stringing together words in coherent ways. That's kind of basically what it does. But the prompts were all about kind of, they were relevant to this course on the history of Christianity in the Americas. That was the course topic. And so the prompts were things like, write a sermon from the perspective of a revolutionary Catholic priest arguing that God supports independence from Spain. So a kind of particular genre, a particular argument to make, and a kind of persona to take to make that argument. Or another one, write a sermon by Jarena Lee explaining why she as a woman should be permitted to teach. Jarena Lee was, I believe, the first ordained African-American woman in the United States to be ordained, I should say. And so these were, again, kind of particular things. Now, so ChatGPT would kind of, produce something, right? So you give it this prompt, and then it's going to give you the sermon. And as it does, right, it's kind of well-formed English text that is coherent and makes an argument. ChatGPT, as I record this, is really good at making like maybe a C+ B- essay, but it's not good at doing certain things. And so the student's job was to then critique the output of ChatGPT. In what ways did it do the assignment well? And in what ways did it not do the assignment well? And as you might, if you've played around with ChatGPT, it's really good at kind of generic answers. It's pretty bad at, and it's good at genre, right? If you give it a genre, it'll create something that looks like a sermon, right? But it's bad at specifics. And so for instance, the student, one of the students noted that the ChatGPT sermon made a lot of references to Jesus, but not a lot of references to Mary. And in that cultural context, Mary would have had kind of more weight with a Mexican Catholic priest in whatever century this was. And so it's that kind of thing where ChatGPT kind of missed the mark, but it was a great activity for students to take what they were learning about the history of Christianity in the Americas and apply it to this kind of mid-grade output that ChatGPT was giving. And Tisa said that the students wrote really great papers. And what I like about this is because ChatGPT will give, I mean, if you give it the same prompt 2 different times, it'll give you 2 different outputs, right? It is kind of stringing words together in this kind of random way. And so this activity meant that every student could have their own unique thing to respond to, right? And then do the practice that they need to apply what they're learning and critique this thing. I also like it because if you had asked students to critique each other's sermons, I don't know that they would have engaged in the same way, right? It's kind of okay to kind of beat up on ChatGPT and say you missed the mark here. And so this is, so far, my favorite example of using generative AI in teaching, because it's just a really nice match between the technology, what it's good at, what it's bad at, and the teaching goals that the teachers had. So our time is drawing nigh. I've got one more teaching principle I want to share with you. And that is what I call thin slices of learning. And I got this phrase from Randy Bass at Georgetown University. He talks about kind of within any learning space, you've got students who are maybe novices and they are developing expertise and moving towards expert status. But there's all this learning that happens in the middle, all these kind of intermediate learning processes. And if we can make visible what and how students are learning, even in little kind of small ways, it can really equip us to be more responsive to our students. And so I've phrased it this way: the more we understand about what and how our students are learning, the more responsive we can be to their learning needs. And technology is really good, actually, at making thin slices of student learning more visible to us. So here's a little example of kind of what I mean. This is a screenshot, and I mean that literally. This is a photograph of our TV screen my wife took last year. This is my stepson playing a game called Mario Maker, and it allows you to create your own levels and games in the kind of Super Mario universe. And I like to think about this is a level that he made, right? And there's some things happening. There's this tube, there's a platform, Mario's there in the middle. There's some bad guy on the right shooting the fireball, right? He had to make a lot of design decisions to create this level. And some of those design decisions are evident in the final product and some are not. If you go to design mode, you can see this is all the different options and buttons and things you can add and things you can take away, settings you can set to create these levels. There's a lot of choices here. When I heard Randy Bass talk about this thin slices of student learning, he was talking about students doing digital video projects for one of his American Studies classes. And he could see the final results, but he didn't necessarily know what happened leading up to that. And he talked about kind of the learning that was left on the cutting room floor, right? Like, what are we not seeing about our students' learning if all we have is their final product? And so I like to think about my stepson designing these games and all the choices that he had to make. Again, some of which are evident in the final product and some are not. So we can use some technology to create these thin slices of student learning. As I mentioned earlier, polling is not just restricted to multiple choice questions. And so you can do free response polls, you can create word clouds. This is a word cloud I created. I was doing a workshop earlier this semester talking to faculty about teaching with AI and how they were feeling about it, right? And so I'm getting this window into my participants' thinking. This is another kind of advanced polling question that I'm fond of. This was from another faculty workshop. So it was one on classroom design and classroom spaces. And so I would show them a picture of a classroom. This is one at the physics department at Boston University. And then I would give them this little coordinate axis that I had designed. So, and I would ask them, is this classroom more about interaction or transmission of information? And is this classroom more multi-purpose or single purpose? And I created that graphic, but then I put it in my polling system and I allowed faculty to then put a dot where they thought this classroom landed on this particular set of coordinate axes. And so you can see here, they mostly thought it was multi-purpose, but they had some disagreement over whether it was for interaction or transmission, right? And so it's a very simple structure, but it's giving me this insight into how my participants are thinking about this one particular example. I shared this in a workshop recently, and then I heard from one of the workshop participants, Justin Schaffer, who's an engineer at the Colorado School of Mines, and he shared with me another set of coordinate axes that he created. He used Google Sheets for this, and he asked his students to come up with examples of innovations, technologies, and then to map them either as ethical or unethical, positive impact or negative impact. And so it's really fun to see what the students come up with. What do they think of as examples of innovations and technologies? And then how do they think of them as ethical or not ethical, right? Again, thin slices of student learning, making that student learning more visible so that we can then be responsive to what they need and what they need to think about. Another quick activity, card sorting. I do this activity sometimes with superheroes where I ask participants to kind of group these heroes in whatever ways they want to, right? And so it's interesting to see what people notice, what people know about the objects of study. I use superheroes because it's nice for a workshop, but you could use any kind of content that you wanted to have students sort and to figure out how they're thinking about it, like what things do they notice, what structural features do they notice. I use Google Jamboard for this. You could use actual cards, right? The technology doesn't matter tremendously in this case. I like Jamboard because it's easy to then show if I have a group of students who have sorted the superheroes in this case in some particular way, I can show that with the whole room and then ask everyone else to try to reverse engineer what the groupings were. This was actually from a group of faculty who did a power analysis here, where they looked at the billionaires, the monarchs, and the outsiders. Those are the groups of superheroes that you see here. My last example is collaborative documents. And so I kind of referenced this just now, but if you're going to send students to do group work, I like to see what they're thinking as they're doing it. And so I'll set up a Google spreadsheet or maybe a Jamboard for students to do some documentation as they're in groups. Again, I learned to do this during the pandemic, but it works great in an on-site classroom as well to make visible what they're thinking and how they're thinking. Gosh, so many good examples. Okay, one more quick one. Bird class. This was an activity from Margaret Rubega, who teaches biology at the University of Connecticut. She teaches a class on ornithology, a class about birds, and she asked her students to tweet about the birds they see as they're going about their daily lives. And I just love this example of kind of field work in action, right? And asking students to apply what they're learning as they walk to work, as they walk to classes. And to do it in a way that kind of makes it all accessible to the entire class. I will say Twitter's gotten a little contested, and she recently moved over to the iNaturalist site for the same type of assignment. But again, getting students to start to apply what they're learning to the real world. I've shared this example with other faculty who've used a similar structure in like civil engineering, asking students to take pictures of the built environment as they encounter it, or pre-service teachers who are observing classrooms and tweeting or noting about what they see there. And the idea here is that when you make student learning visible, you can then be responsive. And so this is the guy who, this is not me. I learned to ski. I do not mountain bike. I like to run. I like to have the ground firmly under my feet. But I can imagine this guy going down this mountain. He's probably been down a mountain before. He's making all these small decisions in the moment in response to the terrain that he's on. And when we start making our students learning visible to us through polling questions or social annotation or whatever the means is, we start to learn more about our students. And in the moment, live during class or between classes, we can then be responsive. I call this agile teaching. I got this term from some physics education researchers who contrasted it with ballistic teaching. That's when you launch a lesson plan at the beginning of the hour and nothing can interfere with its trajectory until it's over. We've all seen classes like that. We've probably taught some classes like that. More agility, I think, is more useful here. So again, 3 big principles. As you encounter new technologies or start to think creatively about using old technologies, these are some things to keep in mind about why and how you might use them. Creating times for telling, giving all your students opportunities for practice and feedback, and making student learning visible in a way that you can be responsive to. So thanks for joining us today. Please stay in touch. I have an intentional teaching newsletter and podcast that you're welcome to track down and find through that QR code. I'd love to interact with you asynchronously as we go forward. So thanks for your time and attention today.